You just started a new job. 3 weeks in, you don't know everything yet, obviously, but you've got the broad strokes, you've read the onboarding documents, you've sat in the meetings, and honestly, you're starting to think your manager is kind of an idiot. Not in a mean way, just observationally. You can see solutions they can't see. You can spot the inefficiencies they've normalized. You arrive at opinions faster than the people who've been there for years, and part of you wonders if that's because you're not weighed down by the assumptions they've accumulated. Fresh eyes, right? That's what you tell yourself. Fresh eyes are valuable. Here's what's actually happening. Your brain has just enough information to construct a map of the territory, but not enough to know how wrong the map is. The roads look clear. The landmarks make sense. You feel oriented. What you cannot see yet are the roads that aren't on the map at all. The landmarks that mean something completely different once you've been there in winter. The entire districts that exist just outside the edge of what you currently know to look for. You don't know about those things. And crucially, because you don't know about them, you have no way of feeling their absence. The map feels complete. It isn't. But it feels complete, and that feeling is indistinguishable from the inside from actually being right. That is not a personal failing. That is not arrogance. That is a structural feature of how your brain handles incomplete information, and it has a name. In 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger at Cornell University published a paper with one of the best titles in the history of academic psychology. They called it Unskilled and Unaware of It. The title alone should have ended several careers and humbled several dinner party conversations, but here we are. In the study, they tested participants on logical reasoning, grammar, and humor detection. Then they asked those same participants to estimate how they'd performed relative to everyone else. The bottom quartile, the people who genuinely performed worst, estimated that they'd scored around the 62nd percentile. They had actually scored in the 12th. They weren't lying. They weren't being defensive. They were, to the best of their genuine ability, assessing their own performance, and they were off by 50 percentile points in the most flattering possible direction. Now here's the part that tends to hit differently. The top performers, the people who actually scored in the 86th percentile on average, estimated they'd come in around the 75th. The people who were most competent were the ones most likely to underestimate themselves. So the curve doesn't just make low performers overconfident. It makes high performers undersell themselves. Confidence and competence are not moving in the same direction. They're sometimes moving in opposite directions, and you've been using confidence as a proxy for competence your entire life without knowing it wasn't reliable. Think about how many times you've been in a meeting and the most vocal person in the room won the argument, not because they had the best information, because they spoke with the most certainty. Think about how many times you've deferred to someone who sounded sure, even though you had a nagging feeling they might be wrong. Think about how many times you've second-guessed your own instinct because someone else presented their opposing view without any visible hesitation. You were doing a completely reasonable thing. You were using confidence as a social signal, the way humans have used it for thousands of years. The problem is that the signal is broken. It has always been broken. You just didn't know it was broken, which meant you couldn't compensate for it. And here's the part that really earns the phenomenon its place in the psychological literature. The skills you need to perform a task well are often the exact same skills you need to evaluate whether you've performed it well. If you don't know enough about logical reasoning to reason well, you also don't know enough about logical reasoning to spot your own bad reasoning. The incompetence is self-concealing. You don't just lack the skill. You lack the apparatus that would let you notice the absence of the skill. It's like trying to diagnose color blindness when you're colorblind. The thing you'd use to identify the problem is the thing that's affected by the problem. And this is why the person who has read one book on investing talks about the market with the confidence of someone who manages a hedge fund. It's why the person who just finished a documentary about nutrition is suddenly certain that everyone around them is eating wrong. It's why the newest person in any room so often has the most definitive opinions. They're not foolish. They're not obnoxious on purpose. They are at a specific, predictable, structural point on a curve that all of us travel through every time we learn something new, including you, including right now, in whatever domain you currently feel most certain about. Take a second with that last part. Not the abstract version of it, the specific version. There's something in your life, some domain, some skill, some area of knowledge, where you feel pretty confident right now, where your opinions feel grounded and your judgments feel sound, where you've done enough reading or enough living to feel like you've got a handle on things. That feeling is real. The question is whether it's earned. And the whole mechanism of the Dunning-Kruger effect is designed structurally to make that question very difficult to answer from the inside. Because from the inside, earned confidence and the confidence that comes from not knowing enough to doubt yourself feel exactly the same. That's the trap. Not that you're overconfident sometimes. Everyone knows that's theoretically possible. The trap is that the feeling of being right and the feeling of not knowing enough to feel wrong are neurologically identical. Your brain doesn't ring a bell when the gap between what you know and what there is to know gets dangerously wide. It just keeps generating that warm, settled sense of orientation. The feeling that the map is complete. The feeling that you understand the territory. It does not tell you how many roads are missing. So that new employee with the confident opinions about the manager's blind spots, that person wasn't wrong to be observant. Fresh perspective is genuinely valuable, but the certainty, that easy, frictionless certainty that arrived so quickly before the complexity had time to reveal itself, that's the signal, not of competence, not of boldness, of a very specific, very predictable cognitive state that has a documented shape, a documented trajectory, and, as it turns out, documented consequences that reach a lot further than a slightly awkward 3-week performance review. That's where we're going next. So now you know what it's called. Good. Knowing the name is the least useful part. Let's talk about what it actually does. Dunning and Kruger didn't just name a vague tendency, they measured it. Precisely. And the numbers are uncomfortable in a very specific way, the kind of uncomfortable that makes you want to immediately think about someone else instead of yourself. Resist that. The study tested participants on logical reasoning, grammar, and humor detection. Humor detection, which is already a quietly devastating choice of test because everyone thinks they understand what's funny. They think this with great confidence. They are frequently wrong. After the tests, participants estimated where they ranked compared to everyone else. The bottom quartile, the people who genuinely performed worst, placed themselves at the 62nd percentile on average. Their actual average was the 12th. They didn't suspect they'd done badly. They didn't hedge. They felt fine. Better than fine. They felt above average. They were in the bottom 1/8 of the room. That's not a rounding error. That's a 50-point gap between belief and reality, and it held across every single domain they tested. Now here's the part nobody mentions when they're using Dunning-Kruger as a way to feel superior to other people. The top performers, the ones who actually landed in the 86th percentile on average, estimated themselves at around the 75th. The most competent people in the study systematically undersold themselves. They knew enough to know the test was hard. They knew enough to suspect they'd missed things. So they pulled their estimate down, below where they actually were, because genuine knowledge had given them a precise and accurate sense of how much room for error existed. The ignorance was confident. The expertise was cautious. If you've ever wondered why the most assured voice in the room so rarely belongs to the most informed person in the room, there's your answer. You're not imagining it. The data backs you up. The paper was titled Unskilled and Unaware of It, published in 1999 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It should be required reading for anyone who has ever had to sit through a confident presentation of wrong information and wonder why no one else looked as confused as they felt. But here's where the popular understanding of this effect goes wrong. And this matters because the popular version is actually a trap of its own. Most people hear Dunning-Kruger and think it means stupid people are confident. That's it. That's the whole thing in their minds. A simple sorting mechanism. Dumb and confident on one side, smart and appropriately humble on the other. That reading is itself a Dunning-Kruger error, which is a level of irony that should be savored briefly before we move on. The actual finding describes a curve, a trajectory, and the trajectory has a section that nobody talks about because it's genuinely painful to acknowledge. It goes like this. You start learning something new. Early exposure gives you a few concepts, a framework, some vocabulary. Your confidence climbs fast, because a little knowledge is enough to make the territory feel mapped. You hit a peak. The peak feels great. Then you keep learning, and something shifts. You start encountering the edges, the exceptions, the cases where your framework doesn't hold, the concepts that contradict the simpler version you learned first. The complexity starts coming in faster than your confidence can absorb it, and there's a drop, a sharp one. Researchers and psychologists refer to it as the Valley of Despair, which is a dramatic name but not an inaccurate one. Bertrand Russell got at the same idea when he wrote that the fundamental cause of trouble in the world is that the stupid are certain while the intelligent are full of doubt. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing a mechanism. The valley is where people quit, not the incompetent ones. The competent ones. The ones who have learned enough to understand the scale of what they don't yet know, but not enough to see that this feeling is normal, structural, and temporary. They feel outmatched. They interpret that feeling as evidence that they were wrong to try. They step back from the thing they were getting genuinely good at, right at the moment when continuing would have broken them through to the other side. You might be in that valley right now, in something that matters to you. And if you are, the thing to understand is that the valley is not a verdict. It is a coordinate on a map. It tells you exactly where you are, which means it also tells you that there is somewhere else to go. Right. Now let's get into where this actually costs you, because so far this has been interesting in a comfortable, abstract way. That changes now. Investing. If you've ever opened a brokerage account, read a few articles, maybe watched some videos, and felt a growing sense that you could probably time the market better than most people, that feeling has a price tag. Barber and Odin published research in 2000 showing that trading frequency among retail investors negatively correlates with returns. The more confidently people traded, the worse they did. The investors who acted on their certainty the most aggressively were the ones most reliably losing money to the investors who did almost nothing. Confidence wasn't an edge. It was a liability with a brokerage fee attached. Medicine. Incompetent practitioners are disproportionately unlikely to seek second opinions. The Dunning-Kruger mechanism doesn't stop at the door of a clinic. A doctor who doesn't know enough to identify the limits of their diagnostic reasoning is also a doctor who doesn't know enough to feel uncertain, which means they don't escalate, don't consult, don't pause. The confidence is the problem. The confidence is what makes it dangerous. Workplace dynamics. A study found that people with below-average leadership scores rated themselves above average at a significantly higher rate than actual high performers did, which means the people most likely to pursue and project leadership are frequently the least equipped for it. And here's where the structural damage really compounds. Overconfident candidates tend to interview better. They're decisive. They don't hedge. They fill silence with certainty. Organizations read those signals as competence. So the hiring process, the very system designed to find capable people, systematically filters in one direction, toward the confident, away from the calibrated. You've probably worked for the result of that filter, maybe more than once. And in 2013, Fernbach and colleagues published research in psychological science showing that people with shallow knowledge of complex policy issues express the strongest opinions. The less someone actually understood about how a policy mechanism worked in practice, the more certain they were about what should be done. The depth of the opinion was running in inverse proportion to the depth of the knowledge underneath it, which means that the loudest voices in almost any political conversation are almost definitionally the least informed ones. That's not a cynical take. That's a replication-backed finding. The pattern is the same everywhere you look. Low information, high certainty, high information, measured uncertainty, and a social environment that consistently rewards the first and penalizes the second. Because certainty sounds like leadership and uncertainty sounds like weakness, even when uncertainty is the more accurate and more courageous position. The map feels complete. It always feels complete, right up until the moment you find the edge of it. And finding the edge is not the problem. The problem is what most people do when they find it. Here's the problem underneath the problem. The bias doesn't just exist, it persists. And understanding why it persists is what separates knowing about this from actually doing something about it. Think about the domains where Dunning-Kruger hits hardest: management, leadership, interpersonal judgment, political opinion, financial decision-making. Now think about what those domains have in common. The feedback is slow, it's vague, it arrives months or years after the decision, filtered through a dozen other variables, softened by the people delivering it, and almost impossible to trace cleanly back to a single choice you made. Compare that to chess. You make a bad move, you lose the piece, you lose the game. The feedback is immediate, objective, and brutal. Nobody softens it. The board doesn't care about your feelings. And Dunning-Kruger is measurably weakest in domains that work like chess, and measurably strongest in domains where the board never tells you directly that you just lost your queen. Your annual performance review is not chess. Your performance review is someone who needs to work with you next year, choosing words carefully, in a room where the path of least resistance is to tell you that you're doing well with a few areas for growth. That's not feedback. That's a social transaction dressed up as feedback. And if your sense of your own competence is being calibrated against that, you are navigating with a compass that someone has quietly replaced with a paperweight. Dunning himself said the antidote is not intelligence. It's specific, accurate, domain-relevant feedback. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Research suggests that simply being told about the Dunning-Kruger effect does not reliably reduce its influence on your behavior. Knowing it exists is not enough. You can understand this entire mechanism completely and still walk into your next high-stakes decision running on miscalibrated confidence, because the feeling doesn't change just because you've named it. The map still feels complete. It always feels complete. So what actually works? Not mindset shifts. Not reminders to be humble. Specific structural behavioral interventions. Here's what the research supports. Before any significant decision, before you commit to the investment, before you submit the proposal, before you end the relationship or start the one, run a pre-mortem. This technique was developed by psychologist Gary Klein and has since been adopted across organizational psychology and high-stakes decision environments. The mechanics are simple. You assume before the decision is made that it failed completely. You then work backward and generate every plausible reason it could have gone wrong, not as a pessimism exercise, as a gap detection exercise. The pre-mortem forces you to confront the knowledge you don't have, because you have to explain a failure you haven't experienced yet. It drags the edges of the map into view. Every assumption you haven't examined becomes a named risk instead of an invisible blind spot. The discomfort you feel when you try to do this in a domain where you're overconfident is the point. That discomfort is your competence catching up with your confidence in real time. Lean into it. Next, ask one question before you finalize any confident belief. What would change my mind about this? Write the answer down, then go find those sources, deliberately. Most people do the opposite. They form a view, and then seek information that confirms it, which means their confidence grows without their accuracy growing, which is the Dunning-Kruger mechanism running on a self-supplied fuel source. Asking what would change your mind and then actually pursuing it is not a natural behavior. It feels like looking for reasons to be wrong. That's exactly what it is. Do it anyway. Track your predictions. This one is unglamorous and most people won't do it, which is precisely why the people who do it gain such a significant calibration advantage. Write down your confident predictions before the outcome is known, not vague ones, specific, falsifiable ones. The project will come in on budget. This candidate will perform well. This investment will be up in 6 months. Then track what actually happens. Over time, your accuracy score tells you something your feelings never will. It shows you the gap between how certain you felt and how often you were right. That gap is your calibration. Error. And you cannot see it without the written record because memory rewrites itself to protect your self-image, quietly editing out the predictions that didn't land and amplifying the ones that did. When you need expertise, find people with demonstrated track records in the specific domain, not people who sound confident about it. Social confidence is a weak proxy for competence. You know this now. Act accordingly. The person who speaks with measured uncertainty and can point to a documented history of accurate judgment in this particular area is more valuable than the person who gives you a clean, certain answer in 20 seconds. Certainty delivered quickly is often the sound of someone who hasn't thought hard enough about the question. And finally, Philip Tetlock spent decades studying forecasting, and the results of that research, compiled in his work on superforecasting, produced one finding that stands out above the rest. The most calibrated forecasters in his studies were not the smartest people. They were not the most credentialed. They were distinguished by two traits: intellectual humility, the genuine, practiced willingness to hold beliefs loosely, and active information seeking, the habit of pursuing disconfirming evidence rather than avoiding it. Both traits are behaviorally trainable. Neither requires a specific level of intelligence to develop. They require a decision and repetition. That's it. Tetlock also found that the best forecasters think in probabilities, not certainties. They don't say the deal will close. They say they think there's roughly a 70% chance the deal closes, and here are the three conditions that would move that number down. That framing forces them to confront uncertainty rather than suppress it. It keeps the map honest. It marks the edges as edges instead of pretending they're the center. Now, come back to that new employee from the beginning, 3 weeks in. Confident opinions about the manager's blind spots. The immediate, frictionless certainty that fresh eyes were cutting through problems the long-timers had normalized. That person wasn't dishonest. They weren't arrogant in the way we usually mean the word. They were at a specific, documented, entirely predictable point on a curve that every single person who has ever learned anything has traveled through, including you, including in domains you currently feel most settled and sure about. The question is not whether you've been that person. You have. So has everyone. The question is where you are on the curve right now, today, and something that actually matters to you. In the domain where your opinions feel most grounded, where your confidence arrives fastest, where you feel least inclined to seek out the information that might complicate the picture. That's where the map is most likely to be missing roads. Confidence is not the enemy. Unchecked confidence is. The difference between the two is a feedback loop, a written record, a pre-mortem, a question you ask before you commit. Small, structural habits that keep the map honest, that keep marking the edges as edges, that keep you from mistaking the feeling of being oriented for actually knowing where you are. The curve doesn't end. You never arrive at a point where the bias stops applying to you. What changes is your relationship to the feeling of certainty. You learn to treat it as a prompt for scrutiny rather than a reason to stop looking. The most calibrated people aren't the ones who stopped feeling certain. They're the ones who learned what to do when they do. So the next time you feel completely sure about something important, sure enough that the idea of being wrong feels almost absurd, ask yourself one thing.